for a discussion of how the pandemic has altered the real estate landscape. I'm joined by Melinda McLaughlin. She is head of global research with Prologis. Hello, Melinda.
Hi, Robert.
Thanks for being with me. So, what's going on right now with the growth of logistics real estate?
So the growth of logistics real estate is accelerating, and it's accelerating because of what happened last year. We saw a lot of trends that had been in the works for a while, but were accelerated by the pandemic.
Okay, and what kind of trends are we seeing there in terms of the types of facilities that are being built, where they're located, what's going on within their four walls? What are some of the high points of your research?
Absolutely. So I think the story that has been much of the focus, and I think one of the easiest for us all to understand, of course, is the e-commerce segment of the market, which is a strong demand tailwind for logistics real estate. For a retailer that's selling their goods online, they use about 3 times as much logistics space as those that sell through brick and mortar. And because of the pandemic, naturally, a lot of retailers had to accelerate their e-fulfillment investment plans in order to serve this much higher proportion of sales that are happening online. Now, let's connect that with logistics real estate, the locations, the types of buildings in demand. Naturally, those are the buildings closest to end consumer. When you're going from a warehouse right to someone's doorstep, you want to have as little time and space in between those two locations as possible.
So I guess that's different from the trend that we had previously seen, the location of gigantic fulfillment centers, such as those run by Amazon, either on the outskirts of an urban center or out of an urban center all entirely. This seems like it has several implications. One is the cost of the real estate has got to be more, correct?
Correct. These are in urban infill locations where there's a lot of competing uses. It's much more expensive.
Hmm.
But they
And
also tend to have a smaller footprint. So when
right,
you think about, if I could,
sure.
connecting to that big mega fulfillment center, it's not really one or the other. They work hand in hand. So the big fulfillment centers are really processing those sales, that inventory much earlier in the supply chain. So we've seen a lot of growth and demand there as well, but it's more for another kind of structural trend that was accelerated during the pandemic for supply chain volatility reasons. So it's probably something we've all seen in the news. Today it's ketchup, it's been semiconductors, it's been the Suez Canal, it's been, plastics. There are so many disruptions throughout supply chains. The pandemic was just the biggest and most global one we've seen in recent times. Now, what that means for retailers is if you don't have those goods on hand, you've lost a sale. You've potentially damaged your reputation. So one lesson learned from the pandemic is definitely, the just-in-time supply chain model is not really built to handle these kind of disruptions, particularly the very large-scale ones. So when you think about designing an e-fulfillment supply chain, getting your hands on those goods kind of as soon as they enter the country, we've seen a lot of very strong demand outside the ports of LA and Long Beach, ports of New York, New Jersey. We see customers diversifying their ports of entry, through Texas by truck, or Seattle, Savannah, Houston, some of these secondary ports. It's all really around this idea of having more control over your supply chain and getting the goods to where they need to be much more quickly and much more reliably.
More control, but also the possibility of more congestion, correct? Because you're already in a busy urban center. All of a sudden, you have a facility with trucks going in and out and people going in and out. That must raise some issues as well.
Absolutely. I think one way my company is trying to align with our most forward-thinking customers is trying to say, how do you make these operations more eco-friendly, more sustainable? My team did or engaged with MIT, who did a really deep dive into e-commerce versus brick and mortar. And one thing they found is when you build out your supply chain and you add a last mile or last touch depot within an urban city center's boundaries, you can cut your transportation costs in half versus doing your package delivery and routing from outside an urban center, because you're spending so much less time transferring or transiting between that last point and the ultimate consumer doorsteps.
Hmm.
So while, yes, I think the immediate the immediate thought is, yeah, it's bringing all these trucks and congestion. Those trucks are going to be going there anyway. The question is, are they making a trip that is, 1 mile, or is it something where they're coming from 30 miles away, bringing you your package? One thing I think the pandemic taught us is e-commerce is here to stay. It served a vital function during a very disruptive time for everybody. And once you kind of accustomed to yourself to that convenience benefits, those choice benefits, consumer habits do tend to be sticky. So I think from a customer perspective, when you're designing your supply chain for the long term, these cost efficiencies, these transportation efficiencies, and the ability to offer really efficient, reliable direct-to-consumer delivery, they're a key cornerstone for the next phase of growth we see customers planning for.
When you're talking about the types of trucks that serve these facilities, at least on the outbound part, the so-called final mile, those are probably smaller vehicles. They're delivery vans or even private cars or regular cars, right? Not big semi trucks going down the streets of these cities.
Absolutely. And that's where the efficiency comes from, right? You have your inbound and it might be a larger vehicle, but you get those economies of scale to much closer to the end consumer. And then you put them on much more agile, smaller vehicles, the Sprinter vans, the delivery fleets for companies like FedEx, UPS. And what we're seeing today, and I find personally very exciting, is the fleet electrification movement, which has definitely received a boost from the infrastructure plans that have been recently proposed. So we had seen already Amazon, FedEx, UPS, a lot of companies announce large-scale purchases of electrified vans, which can not only improve the emissions equation, but certainly make it a lot nicer to kind of be located next to one of those facilities when you don't have the noise and the exhaust fumes, I would say, from those fleets. But I think that that'll also play the technology and the new sources of energy, the new business models that these companies are pursuing. It's really going to really shape the next phase of network planning for these supply chains.
Let's get back to the facilities for a moment themselves in these urban centers. What were they before? Are they actually carved out parts of retail stores? Are they dark stores? Are they converted malls? Are they just greenfield type buildings that weren't anything like that before? What exactly were they, and what do they become?
Yeah. So while there's definitely a lot of conversion activity and some that's coming from uses like retail, like office, many were purpose for an industrial use before. In fact, many of these were fleet management facilities, very low coverage buildings, a lot of yard space, and it can be used by a number of companies. We've seen, school buses. We recently purchased an old Greyhound station. Especially transportation uses, I think, can be easy conversions to, of course, that last mile delivery type operation. But given how in demand these properties are, and naturally the rents, the land costs and values of these properties, it does make more sense to do conversions, to scrape and rebuild. And we see a lot of successful experimentations happening around. All in all, though, we've written about the retail to industrial conversion space. It really is only going to be a drop in the bucket when you think about the normal level of new industrial supply for a few reasons. One, the economics of those deals still don't make sense in many cases. You have to take a pretty big haircut to transition from a retail use to an industrial use. And when you think about what makes a great last touch location, it's the same kind of vibrant consumer indicators that would make for a really successful retail center. So if you're looking to the areas where retail has been struggling, it's usually because the kind of surrounding community doesn't deliver the same strong fundamentals that you would want for last mile as well. So demographics, huge.
Interesting. Are these facilities, we have a lot of, pick up at the curb and things like that have become more popular during the pandemic. Are these facilities such that the consumer can go to them and pick up stuff, or are they entirely built to design to be shipped to the consumer's door or the consumer's address of one kind or another? Are they customer facing in any way?
There are definitely facilities that are being used that way. There are facilities that have a delivery operation and an R&D space. I think there's so much value add being concentrated in these urban facilities because of their location, because of their proximity, because of the type of labor you can attract to a facility in a great location. We see a lot of different models, but I would say the base, bread and butter for this space is definitely going to be more oriented to the high throughput of vehicles and proximity to those end consumers. So
Mhm.
while I think showrooming and the like can definitely play a part because you're already close to that end consumer base, I think where we see most of the industry heading is towards specialization, is really optimizing the layout of that particular property to serve the purpose of last touch delivery.
Needless to say, I assume that you are predicting continued growth in e-commerce for the next 5 years, or that they're pretty much the same pace or even more. What are we looking at in terms of the future of e-commerce and how it's going to affect these facilities?
Yeah, so this is something we wanted to attack head on because I actually think maybe even as early as 2Q, this quarter, we'll start to see e-commerce take a step back. I mean, people are getting vaccinated. There is a tremendous amount of pent-up demand to go out, have an in-person experience. The box office numbers just came out and they were surging. I think the novelty of normal life will definitely mean we'll see a little bit of a switch back, especially I would say through the remainder of this year. But over the long term, we definitely expect e-commerce to continue to gain market share for three reasons. One, the consumer habits are sticky, as I already mentioned. When you kind of realize the benefits, there's a reason why e-commerce has already been growing at a double-digit pace. But two, the supply chain investments piece. So many more customers are accelerating their plans and investing in capabilities that can result in 1 day, 2 day delivery, maybe even same day. And that does tend to yield additional sales. So more people attracted once you can get these types of goods to your home conveniently, reliably in a short time frame. And that's particularly true for some of those segments that had prior to the pandemic, relatively low online sales penetration. So food and beverage, construction, home improvement, there's a lot of investment going into those industries particular, and that's likely to be not only sticky, but continue to grow. And finally, the retail evolution did lead to a pretty bad year for retail store closings last year. It's something that had actually predated the pandemic, and we had already seen net closings. But when you think about then just limiting the number of brick and mortar in-person retail options within proximity to an individual household, you might be forced to go online for certain types of goods because they're simply, not as available in store post-pandemic as they were prior to the pandemic. So for all those reasons, we definitely think we'll see continued growth, although I would expect, a little bit of a pause later this year as we all hopefully enjoy the joy of getting back to normal and being face to face again.
Let's hope so. Melinda McLaughlin of Prologis, thank you so much for sharing your research with insights into the past, present, and future of e-commerce and how it's going to affect logistics real estate. I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.